Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the Wood of the Holly, under the sign in the not-so-enchanted land of LaLa. And I got to tell you, folks, I just had the privilege of reading what was once a brilliant personal memoir and a portrait of an artist as a young man and his mom and dad. It's called The Golden Hour. And I also read his terrific novel, American Dream Machine. And with these two pieces of literary excellence, I believe he joins the ranks of inspired La La Land chroniclers like John Fontaine, Nathaniel West, Carrie McWilliams, The Prophet, Mike Davis, and Eve Babbitt, just to name a few. And now he's here with me to chop it up, break it down, and give it to you straight with no chaser. Welcome to A Rebel Without Applause, the brilliant author and my newest friend on earth. Welcome, Matthew Specktor. How are you?
Hey, man. That was a hell of an introduction. I got a little dizzy listening to that. And I liked The Prophet, Mike Davis. One only wishes that he'd been a little less accurate in some of his foretellings, you know?
Yes, I had him shortly before he died as one of my guests on this podcast, and it was a privilege. Interestingly, he wrote brilliantly about catastrophes in the environment in Los Angeles, specifically about Malibu and fires, and I think you've written about that in some of your commentary. So.
Yeah, I have. I mean, certainly not as well as Mike Davis, but there's the famous essay, The Case for Letting Malibu Burn. I think it was a position he modulated over the years. I think later on he came to not exactly regret that piece, but to feel a little differently.
Yeah, as I recall, it was really about the inequity that the fires exposed.
Sure.
All the resources going to protect, Tom Hanks's kittens in Malibu for the fire, as opposed to like a hotel fire on Alvarado Street.
Well, I think we still see that inequity because, same thing in the Palisades you have in it, but it's even worse because you have Caruso just hiring private firefighters to keep his own properties copacetic and letting everything else burn.
Right. As you said somewhere, the Carusification of the Palisades.
Fuck that guy, if I may be so blunt about it.
And I'm going to echo you because the fires weren't even out and he's already trashing the mayor. It was like, are you running again?
Inevitably, yes. And for all of Karen Bass's egregious failures on this count and others, I don't believe that fellow is the answer. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and he is completely transformed the Palisades. Now, the irony is he can save his precious little fortress there, but without a community around it, it's worthless. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, but I think, this is a longer conversation that we probably don't even need to have here. But that sense of places like the Palisades, which was a middle class community. When I was growing up, it was there was obviously the highlands and there were kind of some areas of it that were ritzier. But the people that I knew who lived in the Palisades and the flats were middle class people, and so I think the sort of bulldozing of that and the kind of pure gentrification of the Palisades of more recent vintage has been a huge bummer to witness as someone who grew up nearby. And in many ways, the Golden Hour is about watching that happen in the movies, watching the creative middle class get destroyed.
Yes, there is an economic sort of story that lurks behind the personal story. And I was particularly intrigued, especially in the beginning, about, your account of Lew Wasserman. And he sort of, to me, was kind of like an avatar. He sort of invents the modern agency profession in a way.
That's exactly what he did. I feel like there's this tendency in historical recountings to imagine that there's one person who reinvents the wheel, and it's always a little more complicated than that. It's Lew Wasserman is credited with inventing packaging and kind of almost single-handedly breaking the old studio system, and he certainly was an enormous engine in doing that. But that was a kind of systemic change. There were other people making similar inroads at the same time.
I remember because I've been an actor too and comedian, I spread my rejection around. You don't want to.
A good thing to do.
You want to share it. You might be doing well in some area. Let's go to this area.
Yeah.
But I do have recollections of those old wood paneled agency offices with the pictures stacked, and then they would get walk through the studio gates with a binder with their actors' photos, with the opportunity to talk to casting people, and there was like the FaceTime was in real space in real time, and there was something I always thought very beautiful about that in a way, personal and
Yeah, it had a kind of grain, I mean, it had a texture. I remember that too. I remember just, how every agent's office would be, kind of the walls would be bricked up with, with script,
yeah.
uh, and, hard copies of scripts. And, and of course the business and the world moved a little slower in those days, right? You didn't have emails, you had memos and, and all that shit. And in a strange way, I mean, look, I don't want to get sentimental or pretend that the movie business was ever a place for contemplative people, right? We know that there have always been executives who don't read and agents who don't read, but I think in those days it was more. There was a little bit more kind of personality and kind of individual opinion and individual judgment, kind of driving things.
Oh
Right?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, your
much.
father reminds me of Willie Loman in The Winner's Circle,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
as opposed to the other Willie Loman.
He's the last man standing, and I mean, he wasn't one of the founders of CA, but he went over in just after, right after those guys started, maybe a year or two later.
Right, and you and I, in a certain kind of funny way, because my grandfather, Ben Kelmanson, whose picture looms behind me here.
Yeah.
Okay, this is him with Milton Berle. Probably when he did Always Leave Him Laughing in the 40s, which was a Warner Brothers movie about a comedian. And then here's another picture. I'm not telling my story, but this is myself and Milton when he came to see me in a nightclub.
Oh, incredible.
And I did a play with him in New York that didn't go anywhere called Goodnight Grandpa. But my point is, Ben, my grandfather, your father, and Lou Wasserman, they're really at this big inflection point of the changing of the guard, the ancien regime. My grandfather, Ben, is there. Hey, Warren, go make Bonnie and Clyde and get the fuck out of my office.
Yes.
That's the story. We talked about printing the legend and Liberty Balance. You printed the legend. I'm kind of just setting a little more light on it. But this is an inflection point where there's a changing of the guard. The Warner's family has divested or is divesting themselves of the studio. Your father, I guess MCA Wasserman's gliding into Universal, Uncle Carl's old home.
Dismantling his agency so he could run a studio, own a studio. And that in so many ways, that the impetus behind this book, behind The Golden Hour, was very much it was in some way, even though it's a very personal book and the family story is kind of front and center. I was just interested in those changes. I realized that I'd seen, between my father and my mom and myself, that we'd all kind of been there at various inflection points, and that there was a kind of long story to be told about what it was like to live through each one.
Yeah, both of your books in their own way are epics. They're multi-generational stories about the changing of the guard. As I speak to you, I'm thinking of How the West Was Won.
Yeah, I'll take that.
Yeah, and now alternatively, How Hollywood Was Lost.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote American Dream Machine in 2009. And there was another book in between that was not a novel. That's different. I think. But between American Dream Machine and The Golden Hour was really the period in which I think the movies came to a real end, and I wanted to get the whole story. Obviously there are still movies. There are the movies as a sort of creative form are gonna exist for a long time, and people will continue to go see them, but they're no longer culturally dominant. Right? It's like, I'm a novelist, and I decided early on. I remember in college, I was 19 years old, and I thought, what should I write? And so, because I was reading everything. I was reading the whole literary canon. I thought, poetry, not a chance. That's not a good idea. Okay, should I write short stories? I kind of realized. There's a curve or a continuum involved here where nobody reads poetry. People do read short stories. And then, and they also read novels. And I thought, okay, if I were to write short stories, I'd have about 15, 20 years before short stories were like poetry. If I were to write novels, I might have about 40 years, which is, but before novels become a kind of increasingly specialist pursuit. And that, which is to say, become read mostly by other novelists. And
Uh,
so I chose wisely within the parameters of an unwise choice, which was, of course, deciding to become a writer at all.
well, one of the things that I related to, and it lives in both books for me,
Yeah.
is growing up in an environment where the salesman is king.
Right. Right.
The
Uh,
salesman is king. The closer rules the world. And for
yeah.
myself, and I'm very close to my father. When I was
Yeah.
a kid, look at him, Billy. That kid's a broadcaster, meaning I was
Yeah.
radio stations,
Yeah. Yeah.
selling time. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. It's
and
interesting.
that you became an artist. In other words, so
Yeah.
your journey and what that meant, and
Yeah.
you ran a gauntlet. And so I felt like both books in their own way were portraits of an emerging artist.
Yeah, they're both certainly thrashing out that question, and hopefully not in kind of selfish or terms that are kind of too narrowly personal. Because whether one person, me, decides to become an artist or not, that's not very interesting. But the question of people's creative impulses and their commercial impulses, or people's creative impulses and the sort of commercial demands of the world, that's a tension that I believe lives in everybody. Right? There's what you want to do, there's what you have to do, and there's how you square those things. And the movies are so kind of pregnant with meaning in that area. I mean, obviously, look, if you're going to work in the theater, if you're going to play classical music, it's like there's an institutional armature that supports that, right? In a lot of ways. But I think the movies, more than anything, are a place where something aspires to be, it's both pure business, right? It exists to make hundreds of millions of dollars for corporations, and an art. And how do you square that?
Well, last night I'm an addict for Turner Classic Movies.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
That's the world. I'm surrounded by dinosaurs because I relate to them because of
yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and I just saw a movie I'd never seen. It was Raoul Walsh directed it. Errol Flynn starred in it. Ward Bond, Gentleman Jim, about
Amazing.
fighter James Corbett. I'd never seen it. I think Jerry Wald was probably the producer, one of those guys. It was fantastic. It was one. I said, wait a minute, it's not quite at the level of Raging Bull. This is
Yeah.
a great movie, though.
Yes. No, I mean, this is the thing. You'll never run out of, it is not possible to run out of great older movies to see. None of us has enough. There are not enough hours in a lifetime to, and even if you weed out all the crappy movies, which we all know have outnumbered the good ones since the dawn of time, it still just never ends. It is an enormous human and creative archive. It's fantastic.
Right, right. I'm going to name some of my favorite directors of the kind of moment. Your father may well have, well, he certainly knew him, but to me, these are my directors that mattered.
Yeah.
Elia Kazan,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
the face in the
Although,
crowd. I mean,
oh yeah. Although I always, think about the Orson Welles clip where Orson sort of, denounces him and just shits all over him for naming names. And that, if you've seen that clip, and then at the end he says, having said that, I have to admit he is a fine filmmaker.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I could talk. I read his book, and my grandfather helped him, and they knew each other. I have a great picture of him and my grandfather. And I recently saw a movie that he had directed that I kind of thought I saw, but I really hadn't. And I saw it recently, where Turner Classic, and I said, "Wait a minute, this is a fucking masterpiece."
Yeah.
America, America.
Wow. What year is that? I haven't seen that.
Okay, that's his story about his grandfather loosely from Anatolia, how he makes it to America. And it's so real, it's so vivid. There are no stars in it except for like Salem Ludwig, who was an actor studio guy. It's fantastic. Thinking about Kazan, and also this is somebody too that I wanted to bring up in relation to you, because Bud Schulberg and his father, B.P. Schulberg. What makes Matthew run? That's what I was thinking as a title of this podcast episode.
Yeah, there's the irony of that is Bud Schulberg. I read in high school. I read The Disenchanted, and I loved it. And somehow, I was very young. I was probably 17, and I was so young that even though I was a Fitzgerald nut, I didn't really understand that Manly Holiday, the writer in that book, is a portrait of Fitzgerald, and a very
Wow.
straightforward one. But I have still, to this day, never read What Makes Sammy Run, which is very funny because I've written extensively about agents, but I think that's probably why I haven't read it. There's a weird way in which I grew up reading. I mean, it's like I grew up just marinating myself inside the literary canon, and for the most part, I went very far outside Los Angeles for my literary education and for most of my models. I don't think I picked up. I didn't pick. I mean, I read Joan Didion because you couldn't get through high school where I went in without reading her, but I didn't read like Chandler until I was maybe 35. Nathaniel
Mhm.
West, same thing. All these writers that I think while I was kind of trying to mark out my own kind of identity, I just felt like, I don't want to, I don't, I'm not ready for those people yet. I have to have a sort of sense of where my own compass points before I want to read those people. And, not, they're all writers that I love enormously. Yeah.
Yeah, about Kazan though, I don't think he got a fair rap from the liberal community about the naming names thing. I mean, it was probably an error for him. But when you read him and you see On the Waterfront, which is about naming names,
Right.
offers sort of his own justification with Bud Schulberg. He had a lot of resentment towards those young people in the 30s about people had treated him cruelly or shunned him who were also nominally communists and that who were looking for alternatives as capitalism was failing all around them.
Right.
Felt like he was an outsider. There's a personal story there that's deeper. And most of the people that criticized him,
Hmm.
if he had called them and say, I'm casting Lonesome Roads, would you like to come in and read? They'd have killed to be in a Kazan picture. So I've mixed feelings about the reaction to him, and I'm a very liberal guy. I just felt like it was a little unfair in retrospect. But, I may be wrong. I know a lot of people suffered mightily for that. I feel like I've been blacklisted for reasons that I don't even understand. But I was, okay, Kazan, William Wyler, Mike Nichols, Stanley Kubrick, Woody Allen, Michael Ritchie, who, by the way, I thought had Bruce Dern in one of the great movies,
Michael Ritchie, and also, I mean, Bad News Bears, baby. And it was actually not my dad, but my mom who was responsible for a key piece of casting in the Bad News Bears.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And then what did I say? Stanley Kubrick, Woody Allen, Michael Ritchie,
Yep.
Arthur Penn, Warren Beatty, and Hal Ashby. So those are
Pretty
sort of
damn good. Yeah.
my
Yeah.
all-stars.
Yeah.
you know, and seemed like your dad was right in the mix with a lot of.
Yeah. He. I'm trying to think. But Hal Ashby, he certainly knew very well. He didn't represent him, but he knew him, and he sold clients. He put Beau Bridges in The Landlord, so he knew Hal from the
Yeah.
very beginning of time. Michael Ritchie, I can't remember. Michael Ritchie may have been a client. He was certainly a friend. We were having dinner at his house. This was when I was in kindergarten, and he said to my parents, he said, I'm making this baseball movie, and I'm having trouble casting the right fielder. We need this. I need some kid that's going to be sort of the runt of the litter. And my mom just said, I know just the person. And she singled out one of my friends, my friend Quinn Smith, who was not an actor, but who wound up playing Timmy Lupus in the movie, simply because she had suggested him.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was funny. I suspect for Quinn it was a little traumatic. He was a great kid and very very smart, very funny. I haven't seen him since we were children, but he was also pretty shy. So I think appearing in that movie and kind of getting chased into the bathroom at grade school by people wanting autographs and stuff, just not his jam as a third grader or whatever he was.
Well, your mother leaps off the pages, and I just as one thing that really got me in your book, the memoir, was when the two young parents are out there on the weekends outing landlords for
Yeah.
breaking the law on the housing covenant.
The fair housing, yeah. She founded the West Side Fair Housing Council, and that's exactly what she would do. She would go out and kind of trap landlords who were unwilling to rent to black people.
Something really beautiful about that, and altruistic and idealistic. And I think I'm trying to recall now, but I think that she bursts out in tears shortly
Yeah, yeah.
after that.
She was, again, and also because she had, my sister, that my parents adopted my sister around that time in 1969, and my sister is biracial, so kind of racial, racial politics and racial discrimination. I think she grew up. My mom had grown up in a very conservative, John Birch conservative type family, and I think there was some, on my grandmother's side, there was some real, some active racism, and my mom just wanted no part of that.
Well,
Uh,
there's L.A.
yeah.
And Mike Davis writes about it. I
Oh, he writes about it better than anybody. It's what you know.
Yeah, and those communities, Glendale, Little Mississippi, San Marino.
All of it. I mean, the way that the freeway system was constructed. All of the things about. I grew up. I think because I grew up. I grew up on the West Side. I went to a good little hippie school that kind of metastasized into a super expensive private school. But when I was there, it really was just
Crossroads, right?
yeah, crossroads. And there was this belief, or that that the kind of room tone was, well, we're all not racist here. This is L.A. This is the Klan is a Mississippi thing, or even like an Orange County thing. But to get older and kind of really realize the way that this city's kind of racial history is really pretty ugly.
Yeah, I mean, I've written about it myself. I wrote a screenplay called Central Avenue.
Yeah.
I always tell people, if you don't know about Central Avenue, you don't know
Yeah.
about LA.
Yeah. And again, I didn't know about that until I was older either.
Nobody does, even today.
Yeah.
Nobody knows that was the center of Black cultural and musical and political and entrepreneurial life in Los Angeles. And it was largely under assault by Chief Parker and the cops. And, I remember when I was a kid, the Watts riots, because I'm little. And the idea, I was little then, but the idea was like, yeah, it was hot and just Black people spontaneously combusted.
Right.
It was 120. What do you expect? They blow up. There was no ever explanation for that. It was a community that had been, politically marginalized through the housing covenants and then subsequent propositions that tried to nullify them. A very brutal police department, underfunded on so many levels, no parks, pools, all this stuff. Also a community that was destroyed, the Central Avenue.
That's right.
Straight out of Compton. It didn't start with straight. It started, it goes back to the 20s and the 30s.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. It's deep. It's deep. I mean, LA really feels in many ways like a kind of inexhaustible subject to me. It's such a deep city. And as someone who grew up in the 80s, when there was a kind of prevailing mythology, 70s and 80s, when, it was just kind of broadly believed that, or at least somehow I was persuaded that LA was a kind of cultural desert. Certainly no place that you could live if you wanted to be a writer. Like not a screenwriter, but if you wanted to write books, to sort of discover the fullness of this place's history, its creative history, it's very, very, very kind of difficult, civic and development history. It's uglier demographic history, all of those things. It's just inexhaustible. It's amazing.
And the water.
Yes, and the water.
Water to the angels. There it is. Take it. I love that moment, when Mulholland's there near Santa Clarita and he hits the thing and the water cascades down the aqueduct. This is 1914.
Yeah.
Chinatown is set in the 30s. The town does a little manipulation, but it's okay. Print the legend. That's the beginning of Los Angeles, really, when that water cascades
that's
down.
right. That's right.
I'm curious, in the process of your book, I mean, clearly your father is a main character. And how did you go about researching and interviewing with your father, which is already a rich and loaded relationship? I'm just curious about what that must have been like, and that you even got through to him on the phone and could get an appointment.
It's funny. Obviously, there was just a truckload of research even outside of my family that I had to do for this book, because there are so many people and many figures who kind of commandeer the narrative and become kind of main characters for long stretches of time, even outside my family. But as far as this kind of stuff about my family and my dad, my mom, who's no longer with us, I had access to her journals and her writings, and and of course I had my memories of her too. With my dad, he doesn't like to talk about himself. He has inherited that Lou Wasserman-like characteristic, right? He can sometimes when I'm at a dinner party with him or something, and someone will ask him, and he'll start telling some story, and I'll be like, "You never told me this." So I did. It was like I interviewed everybody. I interviewed the people who knew him when he was quite young. I talked to my aunt, his sister. I talked to. I had kind of the contours of the story. I knew where he lived. I knew where he worked, when, but I didn't have the story, meaning kind of like what his subjective experience was. And I knew I was never going to be able to get that from him, no matter how hard I tried. But I also thought, well, he's my dad. It's not like I don't know him. It's not like I don't understand him. So I just thought I'm going to write it like it's a novel, and which in many ways this book is. I mean, it's a nonfiction novel. It's full of true stuff, but I wrote it to. It's intended to feel like a novel, and I think it does. I thought I'm just going to have to invent all the interstitial stuff. I mean, I'm just going to have to sort of say, well, he thought that, or he said, kind of to put dialogue into these scenes that happened 10 years before I was born, where nobody knows what was said exactly. But I thought, I'm just going to write it and I'll give it to him. And he's either going to say, wow, this is amazing. You remember it better than I do. Or he's going to say, this is complete bullshit. But I figured either way would be fine, because if he said it was bullshit, then I could twist his arm and I could be like, well, which parts? Tell me. You tell me what's not true. Of course, what happened was the former. He read it and he was like, wow, how do you remember all this stuff?
Well, I wrote this note. I said that the golden hour is fact inspired by fiction, and American Dream Machine is fiction inspired by fact.
I think that's very fair. I've always liked, and there's, in some sense, I go all the way back to the sort of dawn of my reading, and I remember just thinking, memoirs that feel like they haven't really been reimagined enough don't work for me, and novels that don't have some sort of personal, or novels that have a kind of where you have some sense of personal presence, authorial presence, or stake in it. Those tend to be my favorite books. And the latter is kind of hard to quantify, because I think, writers write from, experience inevitably informs a writer's writing, no matter how distant in time. And even in this book, I feel like the most personally revealing and autobiographical part of it isn't the stuff where I'm talking about things that happened to me and my experience. It's the section that I'm writing from James Baldwin's perspective. For whatever reason, that part just felt like there's a lot of stuff in there where I'm like, this is me.
James on the airplane flying to America from France to teach.
Yeah.
To teach Matthew Specktor at some college I had not heard of.
Yeah, Mr. Baldwin certainly had better things to do, but I'm very lucky that he was teaching there at that time. It was a great, a formative experience, let's say.
The book's not on the nose, and even the closing image, which is sort of the reversal of the searchers, as you.
Yeah.
Because the searchers, it's John Wayne going out into the Texas desert. And this is from John Wayne shooting back into the house.
Yeah. In a way, yeah. It's weird, because I had a kind of loose outline for this book, in the sense that I knew the periods I was going to cover. And, obviously I knew what happened because it happened. You never know how you're going to end. I tend to kind of go out of my way not to know how I'm going to end a book. And, usually about 2/3 of the way through, I get a small inkling, and it's like, it's a word. It's usually a word. In this case, it was an image. It was the image that kind of opens the book as well, so that it could have that kind of recursive,
Right, and that's the young image of your dad, is
right.
Very handsome, looked a lot like my dad.
Yeah.
My dad was I hear all these Marine Corps stories. I go, Dad, did anything happen after the Marine Corps? Like, I was born, you built a bit. No, it's just, I don't know if you had that, but the Marine Corps was so formative for my dad's identity.
It was, I think for men of that generation, obviously people still join the Marines, but I think, in some weird way, joining the Army in the 50s was a thing that happened a little more across class lines. Right?
Oh, for sure.
I'll never know, because I wasn't alive then, but I think it had a very different kind of implication than it does today.
I wrote a script called Paradise Cove about a guy who was out of the Marine Corps, and he was a great surfer before, and he kind of runs out of his marriage and ends up pulling up with a bunch of guys in surf shacks above Point Doom before it's developed, right? And the sort of touchstone I had is that kind of guy of that moment is a non-confessional man.
Yeah.
They're not there to talk about their fucking feelings. You'd sooner take a handgun and blow their brains out before they visit a therapist. Their cards were face down. And there's something very masculine I liked about it, something tough. I mean, there's also something really brutal and destructive about it.
Yeah.
I kind of think of Sterling Hayden, as an actor.
Yeah, of course. Perfect example. Yeah. That was man, I love Sterling Hayden, but right. He was
yeah. So that was sort of my image of this character, Mickey Brezhnev.
Yeah.
A little bit of Mickey Dora, Mickey Brezhnev, Russian, Eastern Europe, all that stuff. But, I'm not here to pitch all my scripts, but, your father is opaque.
Yeah, he's opaque. And, and it's, I mean, I'll never know. He's the only parent I've got, but I think, our parents are always a little opaque to us. I think
maybe
there's some level on which, we have an intuitive understanding of them, maybe, but we also have a kind of, I mean, again, maybe I'm talking through my ass here and everybody's like, no, man, I feel like my, the channels are clear as day. I know my parents as I know myself, but I think, it's not unusual to experience your parents as mysteries.
Well, I think this is another parallel between you and I, because right around when I was in high school, maybe my junior year, my dad left.
Yeah.
And he met an actress and fell in love. They're still married, so it's fine. And my mom remarried, and she's okay, and she's great.
It's heartbreaking too. I always think of when Gene Hackman passed a few weeks ago, I had that feeling of he was a client of my dad's too, and
my hero as an actor.
He tells that story about. He should be everybody's hero. He's I think him and Phil Hoffman are the sort of two greatest actors of the late 20th century and beginning of the 21st. He tells that story, I think, on Inside the Actors Studio about the day his dad left. He was out playing in the street and he just looked up and his dad was driving away and just kind of waved, and that was that. And it really it's quite a moment. If you've never seen that clip, it's on YouTube. I think he's very close to tears as he tells that story.
What an I saw last night, or not within the last week, a movie I had not seen in a long time, Hoosiers.
Oh yeah, so good.
With Dennis Hopper, who's been an important person, I think, that you've written about also.
Yeah, of course.
In articles.
Yeah.
And I see these movies, sports movies. My girlfriend go, hey, can we watch this Bridges of Madison County? And it's so beautiful. Oh, all right, we can watch it. And she's crying. What's the matter? She goes, don't you fucking get it? They're in love. It's so beautiful. I go, well, what do you mean? He's just having an affair with some chick who shows up for the weekend or the bright or whatever. Then it's my turn. I go, well, let's watch Rudy, about the guy who's fifth string at Notre Dame. And I'm watching the movie. I'm crying like crazy. She goes, what's the matter with you? Don't you get it? He was fifth string. He got in the game. Are you kidding me? And when I watched Hoosiers, what I would have given, because I played baseball at Taft High School with a fucking racist who didn't like Jews. I saw that movie, Hoosiers, with a coach that was fair and tough and brought out the best in you. And I was literally crying in my bed watching it late at night, thinking what I would have given to have a coach like that. What I would have given.
Yeah.
It sounds silly, but sports have animated my life. And there were some beautiful sort of riffs about the Dodgers and Rick Rhoden and little things. And the voice of our city, Vince Scully,
Yeah. I can't remember if I remember one of my editors trying to cut that line that, hi, everybody. Hello, everybody. And very pleasant good evening to you, wherever you may be. And I just felt like, like they were really squeezing me on the line level. And I was like, I ain't losing that. That's just a fundamental piece of regional texture.
Right. even I start this pod, hello everybody, welcome to another. It's like,
Yeah, exactly.
like I'm sorry, I'm sitting in the press box. Now my family, we're in the radio business. We're KW Spanish radio. We used to do the games for decades in Spanish with Jaime Jarrín and all this. So the Dodgers were kind of part of my dreamland.
Yeah, still are part of mine, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'll tell you a story too, because I didn't really get the benefit of a conversation with my grandfather about the movie business. He died in '74 when I was in high school. Those guys, he lived in New York, would come out to the coast, but the financials and a lot of the distribution, all that was sort of in those days still out of New York. And but one time he came out west and he would go to Burbank, I guess. I'm just a kid. This is in the 60s. And somehow I got invited for a tour. Now, it wasn't like the commercial studio tours. They didn't exist then. It was just a working place. And so somebody was take care of Benny's grandson. And we went into walking around and I'm seeing this magic land. I'd never been in a movie studio. I go, this is the coolest place on earth. And I remember we went into the costume room and there on like a mannequin were two suits.
Right.
One was Clyde Barrow's suit, and one was Bonnie's, and they had the bullet holes from the last scene. Where they had the squibs and that incredibly violent, in the last look. And I thought, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my whole life. Like, how do I get into this world? I'm still trying to figure it out, but I have a memory of that, and that's such an important movie in your own story, really.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's an important movie in the big Hollywood story, I think.
Absolutely. Doesn't get a lot of credit for that movie is Dee Allen.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's exactly right. She doesn't, and she should. This is the problem with most Hollywood productions then and now, probably, which is that people who don't deserve credit try to claim credit. This we all know. And people who deserve credit don't receive it, not all the time, or the movie can be, over credited in one direction.
One of my pet peeves in movies is when they start, the corporate credits are like 5 minutes. This group of producers gets a fucking logo. This one gets a logo. This one gets a logo. Then their names on single title, the names on it's like, cut to the friggin' chase, dude. Start the friggin' movie. I cannot stand that. I always feel like in a movie, I've paid. At this moment, you owe me, meaning the movie owes me. I don't owe the movie. I'm not applauding now.
Right.
Tell me the story. And I mean, the front end credits are just like it's agent land because they've all been pre-negotiated and arbitrated and fought for, that credit. But I find it wearisome.
Yeah. Quite. Quite.
Yeah. Geez, I could do this all day, all night long. I thought both books were terrific and both very ambitious in scope and time and place. It took me a while to kind of get dialed in the novel to the narrator.
Right. Well, the narrator in that
Nate.
Nate. He's doing double. He's doing double duty, which is being a first person presence and also being an omniscient third person narrator. But and that question of is he telling his own story or is he telling his dad's? Whose story is sort of the dominant note is what haunts the novel a little bit. As it probably even though. That one really is a work of fiction. Certainly, I don't have a brother. My dad is nothing like the guy in that movie.
Bo is not like Fred.
No, not in the slightest. I think I was probably transferring some of my younger anxieties about. Sometimes you get asked if you have anyone who has a successful father, sons with successful fathers. That is just and I think, and honestly, I think it's such a generational thing too, because I think for silent generations and boomers, success was easier to come by. The sort of, economic conditions, the sort of economic security that they were able to reach, much, much more difficult for Xers and millennials and beyond.
I would agree.
So, it's like it's a whole ball of wax. I don't remember ever sort of feeling like I was laboring in my dad's shadow because I was really working in a different, I was trying to write books. I was trying to write, I was trying to break into the world of literature, so to speak. That was not my dad's world. And I think in a lot of ways, that's why, it's like I was trying to kind of escape from the world of the movies. when I was younger, I certainly didn't think I was ever going to write about it.
Well, I can relate to what you're saying. And just to roll the film a little bit backwards, the latter half of the American 20th century was probably the most dynamic period of economic expansion in the history of the world that I can even imagine, particularly in America, and particularly for Jewish people in
Yeah.
America.
Yeah.
I mean, this whole idea and mythology of success.
Yeah.
If you had put Ben Kalmanson, who scuffled out of the ghettos of Pittsburgh through steel mills and was discovered, I say that because he sold a car to the Warner Brothers sales rep, and he said, "You're a pretty smart Jew. Why don't you come to work for us? Give me 2 weeks." And he goes, sells a bunch of movies in the West Virginia, Pennsylvania area. Here, this is easy. And next thing you know, he's head of distribution. And then but if they don't come from Russia, he probably dies in a friggin' concentration camp. If Steven Spielberg is born 100 years earlier, he's fortunate to be a tailor in Anatevka.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So, and a lot of people, and I'm not saying it's my dad, but it is a temptation, this idea that I did it on my own.
Yeah.
And nobody does it on their own. They're sitting on this pyramid of good fortune if they did it. That is actually really unique in human history.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. It was a different, that it was not a normal, it was a historical aberration.
It is. And maybe we're coming back to a crueler norm right now, politically and economically. I mean, I grew up admiring these movies, that some of which you've talked about, certainly the directors and the movies they made, with a pretty powerful confidence that I would get the chance to participate in a deep way. I studied with a guy named Jack Garfein. You may have heard of him.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Actors and Directors Lab and Group Theater, not Group Theater, Actors Studio here. And he was a great mentor. And Stella Adler, who famously
yes, of course,
Brando. And, and I was a stand-up, and I still am, and I wrote all these scripts, and I just felt like, there was a destiny there for me. Yeah. I'm going to admit that it did not come anywhere close.
Yeah.
What I had hoped for or imagined.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways, it's like the book that came between Dream Machine and The Golden Hour is very much a kind of examination of 20th century mythologies of success. And I think, look, that still perseveres in American culture in this kind of even more kind of grotesque, hypertrophied way, right? You have the whole notion that, that everybody should be a founder, everybody should be a CEO, everybody should grind their way to having, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's just like, you fuckers, find something more worthwhile to do with your souls if you have them or ever had them.
Yeah, I mean, the 47 with 34, and it should have been more. Talking about the PVP, Putin's vice president, the 47th president, 34 felonies, felon in chief, is the coarsest, shallowest, most corrupt version of that word success, and the everybody else is a loser. And it's a cancer on our souls.
Yeah.
My view, gee whiz, I got to tell everybody, read, get on. I read through the iBooks and stuff like that, the Apple iBooks, and because I don't have enough space.
Yep. I feel you. I've got the same problem.
Read the frigging Golden Hour. It ranks as one of the really great tells of Hollywood.
If I had a copy on my desk, I would.
Yeah, I might. Neil Gabler, he wrote the book about the Raging Bulls.
Yeah.
Easy Riders, Raging Bulls. There it is. It ranks right.
Biskind. That's Peter Biskind.
Oh, yeah. Neil Gabler was
Neil Gabler wrote An Empire of Their Own, which
Empire of Their Own. Okay,
amazing.
Yeah.
Also an amazing book.
Also, of this sort of have the Jews invent Hollywood and invent Gentiles. Read The Golden Hour and take a deep dive into a portrait of an emerging artist and his mom and dad, both very touching portraits in their own way. Your mom for very different reasons, but your father also, he must be incredibly proud of you for the journey that you've created.
If it is possible for a parent to be obnoxiously proud, my father has crossed that threshold, and it's very lovely.
He might even be returning your calls now.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
You know, there's a Yiddish word. I was kvelling, and I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't even know the fucking guy. I'm kvelling over this book. And
I'm
then,
glad.
and then
very glad. That's
American
lovely.
Dream Machine, which is a novel, but like I said, it's fact and fiction inspired by fact, and it takes you into the mindset. And you know, I'm going to just kick it around. I love to surf. I'm out there in Malibu. I have a lot of friends on the west side, and there's a lot of friggin' wreckage out there from sons of and kids of, you know, who were fortunate or to live out at the colony and, you know, had all the privileges of the west side. And you have managed in your own way to avoid that wreckage and come out on the other side of it, you know.
It took some doing, man, let me tell you.
Yeah, but I haven't met you in real time, but I fucking love you, and I love the novel. And there's also a smattering of really cool articles that you've written and commentary, and you now join the ranks of some of these really great chroniclers of the land of LaLa. So
sounds crazy, but I'm not gonna contradict you on that point. So thank you. That's very kind.
Folks, check out the books, and thanks for hanging with me till next time. Namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namasaloha.
Beautiful.